Welcome to the Jiu Jitsu Oracle, where we're going to go over some big talking points coming out of the Polaris event that happened in the UK. I'm Ross. I'm joined as always by Calum. First of all, ecological fanboys and fangirls, be prepared, because I'm going to suggest that style of training is not all that you need to be great at Jiu Jitsu, and that you should be working on your drilling and your precision mechanics, because I think the Art of Jiu Jitsu crew that was at Polaris were a step ahead, if not more than a step ahead of their opponents. And if I was watching anyone on that card and thinking to myself, I want to be like that guy, it would be Tynan Dalpra, who scored a decisive submission victory over Tarek Hopstock. So, Cal, what did you think of the AOJ guys, Tynan, Abate and Diego Pato? And do you agree that a strength that they have over their opponents is just how precise they are in their movement and their mechanics, and how they go about their jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, I think they all look great. Well, the matches went relatively as expected, for me anyway. I think when we were predicting Tynan's submission, I think the submission he was going to go for was right in front of our faces, but we didn't really think about it at the time. Probably quite obvious in retrospect that he would try to Plata Tarek. Yes,
No. Can I interject? I didn't think Tynan would be as cheeky as to go for a Tarek Plata on Tarek.
Yeah.
Tynan is a much cheekier boy than I imagined him to be. So, yeah, he was going for the Tarek Plata. Ultimately never got it. Tarek submitted essentially to like a Kimura, I guess, before Tynan whipped the leg around on his second attempt at the Tarek Plata. But yes, you're saying that. It was staring us in the face in that, okay, it would be cool if Tynan could hit that move on the inventor of it. I just didn't think Tynan was that type of guy. But we've seen another side to Tynan now. Anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, so they all looked really good. As far as the question about drilling, I think there's obviously many ways to climb to the top of the mountain, and the ecological guys do it one way, but if you're looking at those guys, their sample size of really like one or two guys that are at the elite black belt level versus everyone else, obviously their way works for them, but a lot of other people do drilling. And if you look at one of the biggest anomalies as far as getting to a super high level in the sport without any prior grappling experience, so that excludes guys like J-Rod and Nicky Rod that obviously had wrestling backgrounds. If you look at Joseph Chen, who has got to the level he's gotten in 5 years' time, he's a big proponent of drilling in specific, I think he calls it dialogue drilling. So you'll basically talk with his partner, make sure that every grip and body positioning is in the correct space, and he'll ask them how this feels, and he'll experiment. So he's very big on being precise with where he puts his own body and where he grips, etc. So go back to AOJ as well, they're obviously very precise in how they do things, and obviously they do a lot of other stuff as well. If you ever subscribe to AOJ Plus, you get a look into their competition classes when they're preparing for their big competitions, and they don't do a lot of drilling in that. They do a lot of specific rounds. They do a lot of rolling with gi coaching in the background, giving specific prompts to specific athletes, but they do also, outside of that, have a lot of heavy drilling sessions. That's obviously not going to be as exciting to watch as their competition classes, which is why it's not put on there. But yeah, they've got a really good mix of everything. I think the optimal way, in my opinion, to do things is if you're learning something new, you might be at the level that you can just learn something new and do it correct off the bat. However, if it's a bit alien of a movement to you, maybe you're really good at jiu-jitsu, but you're learning a judo move or something, it might take you a little bit more time to make sure you're getting all the details correctly. So I think that's really important, because there is a correct way to do things. Most of the time there's obviously going to be variations depending on body size and attributes, etc. But for a lot of things, there's going to be a largely correct way to do things. Once you've got that down, then you can learn the other things in the system. You can make sure you're identifying the correct technique to do it at the correct time. Then you can start to introduce some resistance in the form of isolation sparring, and then you can try integrate it into your rolling game. For me, that's the most ideal way of like developing your skills and getting better. I think just purely doing the games and situational is a great tool in and of itself, but I think you're missing a big part of the picture, and I think teams like AOJ demonstrate that quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think having a coach like Guy Mendez, who will give you specific instruction and expect that to be carried out, is huge. And I think now you see at the top level of jiu-jitsu, we have these teams headed by coaches who are very sort of insistent in doing what they expect to be done. Now, there's different ways about it. Guy is different to John Danaher, for example, but it's like you've got a guy at the top, you've got everyone underneath buying into what they say, and then they're carrying out what's instructed of them. And I think like that's a big difference in jiu-jitsu. Now, at the top level, having these guys. Now, within that, there's room for creativity. There's room for adding your own little bit of flavor to what's going on. Not all of the Art of Jiu Jitsu guys are like cookie cutters. They play a little bit differently. But I do think that's like something that's happening at the very top level of Jiu Jitsu is like the best teams have exceptional coaches, and then those athletes are buying into what those coaches are telling them.
Yeah, I think it's just about having all the training tools in front of you, then just selecting the right thing at the right moment. If you're learning something completely alien and then you just see something, maybe you saw someone do a cool throw at CGI and you're like, okay, I'm just going to try do that and roll in, like that's probably not going to work out too well for you. At the same time, though, if you're doing something that you're already very good at and you're like, oh, I'm going to drill this 1,000 times, like that's also not going to be a good like productive use of your time. I think doing the technique until you've got it down and then introducing resistance. If things are working out well, that's fine. Just keep doing the resistance-based training. And if things aren't working out, then you go back to the dictionary of whatever DVD or whatever instructor you're working with to make sure that you're ironing out whatever details you were missing that was making the technique not work for you in the live resistance, and then just going back and forth between those two.
But like, we look at your class at SBG Aberdeen on Monday night, you introduced a movement to help people with their guard passing, a cross step, right? So I don't think they would have found that just by themselves. They might, or one or two might have, but the whole class wouldn't. And then people who weren't used to that movement needed time to not just get used to it, but try and make it like as close to perfect as they possibly could, and then to try and work out the timing of when to use it so it actually gets you into the space that you're trying to get to, etc. And that kind of footwork is what I see the AOJ guys being exceptional at, and that's practice.
I was debating getting them to do a drill at the start, which I've learned from AOJ ages ago, and it's like been a cornerstone of my outside passing ever since. But it's almost similar to that drill that you see a lot of the Brazilian teams use for cardio, which is just grabbing the legs and going side to side. And it wouldn't be so much to blast their lungs or anything. It would just be to get that side to side movement of cross stepping and covering a lot of distance quickly and efficiently. So I was debating getting them to do that, but ever since I've done that drill and gotten that footwork down, it's paid dividends in my passing since.
So I think precision movement is very, very important. Cole Abate looked very, very good in his win over Sam McNally. Cole, we think, coming back from injury. So hopefully that's him now back on the elite competition scene. And then Diego Pato, who's like more of a recent signing to AOJ. So I think we see him play a bit differently to Tynan and Cole. But he had a good win over Ash Williams. But yeah, I just think like all in all that AOJ crew show that there is a place for working on your mechanics and very specific mechanics instructed by the exceptional coach.
Even I remember a fairly recent training video from New Wave, and Danaher was teaching some butterfly guard, which I'm sure Gordon's been doing for years, and Gordon was like statically drilling it. Like, maybe you wouldn't think that was the best use of time, but he was still trying to like refine small details, even though that's a game that he's been very good at for a very long time. So there's another example from the very best in the game.
And talking about the need to have like your specific mechanics locked in, I think there are 3 matches I want to talk about now where one of the matches had a finish, and then 2 of the matches went to decision. The match that had the finish was Cammy Donnelly beating Dom Dillon with an expertly applied leg lock, and Cammy was so precise in what he was doing. I think the fact that it was early on in the match helped, because like I think with the other 2 matches that we're going to go on to talk about, it was later in the match, and you know, guys' adrenaline and heart rates and all that would have been well up by that point, and maybe they just got a bit excited. But yeah, I thought like Cammy's finish against Dom Dillon was exceptional, and I think it just goes back to like, I would imagine, I don't know, I've not trained with Cammy, but I'd imagine like he has gone over that position very, very precisely many a time, because it just looked like so well controlled throughout.
Yeah, I legitimately think that in that specific position, he is legitimately one of the very best guys in the world. I've rolled with him. I know when he actually gets a good bite on the legs, it's a very dire situation. And I think in that 66 kilo division, if Cammy got to that position on a lot of those guys, I wouldn't favour much of them to get out, to be honest. So yeah, just a complete expert in that position. And I'm sure that was built up through various methods, making sure all the details and techniques were done correctly to begin with, and then just tons of time spent in the position with live resistance between positional rounds and rolling.
Now, the 2 matches that didn't have finishes, but were kind of close to finishing, and we'll get on to talking about the scoring in both of them in time, but like the 2 matches I'm referring to are Mohammed Avtarhanov against Jay Rodriguez and Davis Asari against George Pierce. And in both of them, we saw one guy sort of like having the better of the early parts of the match, and then another guy putting it on at the end. Now, we'll get more into like the specifics of the match and the scoring system in time, but I just think we saw J-Rod trying to face crush, face choke Mohammed off the back, and I think like if he'd have shown like a little bit more finesse with the finish, like if he hadn't been just so headstrong and trying to squeeze the guy's head, then maybe J-Rod would have got the submission. And I think it was like in the match, it was becoming evident to me that like you're basically going to have to put this guy to sleep to get the victory. So once it becomes that, you really need to be then, you know, working out how you can achieve that, rather than just trying to use like brute force, which I think it looked like Jay was trying to do. But like, what did you think of that finish, or lack of?
Yeah, I think for me, for a long time, I've used face chokes. I think if you can lock anywhere in like this sort of zone and get the correct angle and purchase on it, and then tighten everything up and readjust correctly, obviously it will take a little bit longer, but I still think you can put people to sleep with the arms being over the jaw. Getting higher than that is not something I've really experimented with, so I can't really talk about it, but I think it would be probably quite difficult to actually put someone to sleep much higher than that. But I think like teeth and jaw area, you can still definitely put someone to sleep, but you've got to do it in the right way. Is a lot less adjusting you need to do if you just get under someone's neck and you've got strong arms and you squeeze. If you're over the face, I think you need to do everything a bit more precisely. Need to try and line up the elbow perfectly with the jaw, need to get everything angled correctly, get the chin pointing down, need to adjust your arms. Like personally, I like to try crawl my arm up to my shoulder, so I'm using as little energy from my muscles as possible, trying to get it structurally tight before I actually squeeze anything. So yeah, there was maybe some lack of that from J-Rod, and like you say, if someone's not going to tap to any sort of pain and you will have to put them to sleep, then you do need to put everything perfectly technique-wise, especially if it is over the jaw and not under the neck.
And then we had George Pierce have a terrific sort of come from behind late surge against Davis Asari, whose gas tank appeared to be absolutely empty in the last stage of the match. But I think George had 2 attempts at an arm bar and 1 attempt at an arm triangle. And to be fair to George, like, he stepped up, I think, from the undercard for the match. So he's sort of like coming up to that main card level. And I think, like, with the way the match went, he probably just had like a huge surge in that last 3 minutes, maybe even getting a bit panicky to get the finish because it was like so close and it had been such a big win for him. But I just think some of the mechanics were out on the finishing attempts, and like the difference of that compared to Cammy Donnelly, who, like, fair enough, it was very early in the match, but like you've said, he is one of the best in the world at those finishing position. And then like the likes of the AOJ guys are like super, super precise. I just think that, like, if George had managed to settle himself down into that arm triangle a bit better, had his shoulder a bit lower on Davis, and then also, like, with the arm bars, if he'd like focused more on limiting Davis's movement rather than like trying to do like quite like a sort of rudimentary breaking position, shall we say, then he might have had a better chance at like getting the win. But like, what did you think of like just that last 3 minutes of the match where George was putting it on?
Well, before that, I actually think some of Davis's finish mechanics, or like how he used his energy to finish, perhaps led him to that state of being exhausted in the later part of the match. Seen him go for leg locks and just like tense everything up and have that like psychotic look on his face, like he just wanted to break it. And then when he got on his back as well, very much looked like he was just like straight off the bat, squeezing, putting everything into it. And I think you're better, even if your mechanics are good, you know, if you go like all out for 5 seconds and then someone feels like you're starting to let off a bit, that's going to give them some life and some hope that they're going to get out of the submission. I think you're better, like we spoke about, technically adjusting everything and then just putting on slowly over time and slowly building up. So hopefully at like 30% of your power, you're starting to choke them, and then you're ramping it up instead of just like giving everything to it like off the bat. It's not really the most technical or strategic way of going for it. So I think that perhaps led him to be in that exhausted state in the later half of the match. And then, yeah, as far as George, it is understandable, just given the position that he was in and how excited you would be having someone so world-class that you survived the first couple of parts of the match against, and then you've got this opportunity to make a massive name for yourself and submit someone like that in a moment that you only really found out about on the day. So that's obviously like a massive thing for him. But yeah, I think a couple of the submissions he went for weren't technically the best. Like his elbow didn't seem to be in the right position for the arm triangle, wasn't right down connected to the shoulder, and then for the arm bar as well, I thought he would have had a better shot trying to break it over the hip, where you've got that hard surface of your hip and then you've got all that room around your body to break it, as opposed to kind of limiting the range of motion by pushing it into your own chest, the old school way of doing it. You can definitely break someone's arm like that, but you don't really have much room to like catastrophically break someone's arm just by pinning it to your chest and hipping in. I think you've got a lot more room to do that by going around your own body and breaking over your hip.
I think if you go to the hip as well, it adds the fact that you can go to the angle that they're giving you as they like wriggle their arm around. And like if you're just always persistent in keeping it straight, then they know you're keeping it there and they can kind of like hide the elbow, turn the wrist, etc. Right? So I think like that's another reason why you might like look for a different angle to finish it, because Davis did do a very good job at like wriggling his arm around, and we've seen Gordon do that in training videos as well. So it's obviously something to work on at New Wave.
Yeah.
But not something that you're going to get out of not drilling that position under very controlled resistance, right? So that's another reason why that's an important tool to add into your training. Right, the scoring of the matches, pretty controversial in that Mohammed was given the nod against J-Rod, and Davis was given the nod against George. I think Davis getting the nod is less controversial. I've rewatched that match, and although George put it on in the last 3 minutes, the first two stanzas of the match, and I should go into how Polaris scored it. So the 10-minute match, they split it into 3-minute 20 portions, and then the judges give the nod to one of those guys, one of the competitors in each of those sections, to ultimately come up with a decision. So this is where the problem kind of lies, though. So if you narrowly win stanza 1, narrowly win stanza 2, and then get a shoe in stanza 3, like, you'll win the match. And that could be like the equivalent of winning like first and second round 10-9, and then getting beat in the third round, not even like a 10-8, like a 10-6, a 10-4, or something like that. So I think like this is the problem when you just have like the equivalent of a 10-9 system, or a 2-1, or a 1-0 even. It's probably like a 1-0 system, right? In that Davis won the first section 1-0. He won the second section 1-0, and then George won the last section.
Yeah.
Like 1-0. But probably George's last section was like 8-0. And like the middle section where Davis was on George's back the whole time was probably like 3 or 4-0. And then like the first one like was probably like much closer. Say like Davis, I think, had a back take in the first and a couple of sub attempts. So maybe like 4-0 as well. So maybe you come out of that like a draw. Like Davis wins 2 stanzas 4-0, gets beat 8-0 in the last, and it's an 8-all draw. But it just like, it seemed weird when you have someone finishing so strongly and then it goes to the decision and then they lose. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's kind of like, I think it was a bit of a shame because I enjoyed watching the Polaris event. I thought there was loads of good matches. But the first thing I saw when I went online was like how 2 of the matches had controversial decisions and people were slagging off the scoring system and all this kind of stuff. And you don't want that to happen. And then I'll bring you in on both these matches in a sec, but just on the Mohammed Avtarhanov against J-Rod match, it was very similar. Mohammed probably edged the first 320 of the match. Like, there was a little wrestling exchange and Mohammed ended up kind of on top, but it never really settled on the ground. And then he also had a wrestle up where he had Jay's leg like really high up on his shoulder, and then it got reset in the middle, which I think they could have reset it with the leg still up on the shoulder. But Mohammed then pulled guard off it. Jay put in a body lock. Mohammed swept to top because he still had a hook in with the leg, which was a very, very nice sweep. But then in the last 320, Jay really upped the pace, got to the back, and then like the last part of the match was just Jay putting it on with a face crush. So again, like, even Mohammed admitted in an interview afterwards that he kind of thought that, like, you know, he didn't win the match. So I just think like we need like a better scoring system than just having these like binary choices between one athlete and another in the stanza. Anyway, Calum, I'll bring you in now. I've talked for long enough.
Yeah, so with Mohammed and J-Rod, obviously one of the biggest talking points is the breaker performance of Mohammed. Most people probably had not heard of him. I think that was his Polaris debut. And then to go straight into a co-main event against ADCC silver medalist and win the match, regardless of what you thought happened in the match, it was very competitive. So for someone that was pretty unknown to have a very competitive match against ADCC silver medalist, that was super impressive. And I was very impressed with his game as a whole and looking forward to seeing him in future Polarises and other shows. But yeah, I think it just doesn't make any sense. You kind of see the problem in MMA because they are so reluctant to hand out 10-8 rounds. I think you need like a couple knockdowns in a MMA fight to get a 10-8, even if you get like one knockdown. A lot of the times they don't give out 10-8s, and then you see that in matches where someone will just coast by. The first 2 rounds, say that the stand-up's completely even, and then they just like score a takedown at the end of the round, and they do that twice, and nothing really happened off of that. But then in the third round, they get the crap beat out of them, but it just wasn't enough to justify a 10-8, and then they lose the decision, even though the guy that won comes out with a bloody face and has clearly won the match overall. So it's just that sort of situation. You need either to give out 10-8s and give them out freely, not like being reluctant to give them out. I think CGI was quite good for that in their scoring. They were quite happy to give out 10-8s and even some 10-7s. So you're obviously going to run into issues where people are going to coast by in certain rounds and then just get blown out the water, but that can't be reflected in the scorecard because how you've created your scoring system.
I think Pride's an interesting example to look at back in the day as well, because they had rounds, but then the fight was scored as a whole. So, like, we could watch those Polaris matches, we were judging, and we could say, okay, like, one of the guys snuck the first, snuck the second, the third was decisive. Let's look at the fight overall. Who do we think won the fight? Okay, the guy who had all the action at the end has done enough in that last stanza to be given the nod. Let's give it to him. I just think, like, that gives, like, a better outcome than having this very, like, binary, stricter set of score where you're like, okay, that guy's 1-0, 1-0, the other guy's 1-0, right, it's 2-1. It's just like, that's just not a reflection of what happened in the match.
Yeah, now that you're saying that, a kind of light bulb just went off in my head, whereas Pride had rounds, they only had the 2 rounds, and they judged the fight holistically. Why, in a match where there isn't even rounds, are you judging it as rounds? That just doesn't make any sense. Like, it's one match. They're not having 3 matches on 3 separate days. Just judge it, what happened in the match. Like, it just seems like they're trying to be different doing that. I know that they offer people to use their scoring system in their own competitions and stuff, so I don't know if they're just trying to be unique because of that, and I don't know if they maybe get money from competitions adopting their scoring system, so maybe that's got to play with it, but aside from just trying to be unique and different, it just seems a bit silly, to be honest.
I think we're still looking for the optimal no-gi scoring system. I think CGI had plenty of credits to what they were doing, but then in the end, like, we still had, like, a big argument over, we didn't, but, like, people in the comments did, over, like, whether Levi or Cade should have been given the nod in that match. So I think there's still work to do as a sport. I think it's good for promotions to try different things and come up with different ideas, but Polaris has changed the way they score already. It was mentioned in commentary that Ash Williams had a match with was it Paulo Miao?
Paulo Miao, yeah.
Yeah, and Paulo had, like, the better of the match, but because Ash had spammed some submissions with it, he got the nod under the rule set as it was at the time, but then they changed the rule set thereafter. According to the commentators, I should add. Like, I can't remember that match off the top of my head. But anyway, I think, like, we it does need some tweaks, and it's just a shame when, like, you know, a lot of the chat was about those matches and the scoring in them rather than, like, the action necessarily. Now, to give Polaris credit, Calum,
yeah,
they took Felipe Andrew off the card after it was announced that Felipe had failed a USADA test, right? I think it's, like, the best way I can describe it. So,
yeah.
Polaris have a
Clomiphene that he failed for.
Okay, Polaris have a protocol where any athlete who's serving a suspension, they won't use on their card. So that's unlike other promotions. So Felipe Andrew was taken off the card late on, and I know you want to give Polaris some credit for doing that. Yes.
Yeah, I saw that they posted about that on Instagram a while back, and then, as far as I can remember, this is the first time they've implemented that, and they implemented it pretty close to the event in a way that was a big inconvenience to them, but they stuck to their word and did it anyway. I think it's really good that they're doing that and important for them to be doing that. And I think the only way we can see a change in the sport, we all know it's quite a dirty sport as far as PED use. Know a lot of the top guys are doing it, and we know that a lot of events don't really care about guys doing it. So the only way for that to really change is events like Polaris to say that, you know, if you pop for these sort of drugs, even we know that Jiu Jitsu is not the biggest money maker, so events like Polaris can't exactly hire WADA to go and do tests on all their different athletes. So that's fair enough. You know, if there's not the money for it and businesses can't do that, that's totally fine. But if we know that someone has popped from another organization, then it would be good for other organizations to honor that and not have that athlete compete on their event. And I think that's the only way that we'll see change as far as PED use in the sport.
Okay. And then last point I want to make on the Polaris show is, now that it's over, what's next, right? Because, like, I think one thing about it is, as a set of matches, I quite enjoyed watching the event, but there was a lack of buzz going into it. I saw online, like, people didn't even know that it was happening, like, on the day. And then coming out of it, like, nothing's really been set up for the next event. I just think there's, like, a lack of narrative around about what's happening. Coming off the back of, like, ADCC and CGI, I think they're easy matches for promotions to try to make. I'm not saying it's easy to make them, but if they can be made, then it kind of makes storyline sense, you know, and we've already highlighted some of them. Like, you could make Bedoni against Tynan, you could make Kynan against Nikki Rod, Adele Fornerino against Fionn, or Anna Carolina, they make sense. So coming out of this event, we had a call out on the show. Jed Hugh would like a match against Owen Jones. That's a Battle of Britain. To me, that makes, like, absolute sense to try and make. Owen would have to go up a little bit from where he's been competing at. Jed would have to come down a little bit, but I think it's, like, a match that could be made in, like, the low 70s. So hopefully that happens. But just, like, I saw Polaris announce their next event, and the first match they've announced is Nia Blackman against Helena Cravar. And while it's a UK grappler against, you know, a grappler of renown from the States, I just don't see, like, any sense competitively as to, like, why it's happening, why they've made the match. So I just think, like, I'd like to see a bit more storyline, a bit more narrative as to, like, why these matches are happening.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's quite shocking to me that after the biggest jiu-jitsu weekend of all time and the biggest jiu-jitsu events of all time, that there's really no capitalizing on that from promotions. I know a lot of guys will be injured coming out of that weekend. I know a lot of guys might be taking some time off, given that they would have had really hard training camps and their whole year building up to that event. So that's fair enough, but I'm sure there would be plenty of other athletes willing to compete afterwards, and all it would take would be who's number one shortly afterwards to be like, make an event called ADCC CGI The Aftermath, and like that in itself is very interesting, and they could have all these fun matchups and capitalizing off of the hype of that. I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in watching that, and we've not really seen any event capitalize on that at all. Like I say, I don't know if it's because a large percentage of the athletes are injured or taking time off, but I'm sure there still would be plenty willing to compete for the right price. So that's a bit disappointing that we've not seen that as of yet.
Okay, so perhaps on a future episode of the Jiu Jitsu Oracle, we'll do some fantasy booking and come up with a card that we would like to see and get into how we think those matches might play out. Because I'm sure, like, in time we will see some of these matches happen, but it feels like we had that huge rush into the big ADCC CGI weekend, and then now it's all a bit after the Lord Mayor show, and kind of like it's gone a bit quiet. And I think, like, this is the time where, like, grappling should be trying to push on and build on what happened, you know, when there was a lot of buzz about it. So if you're watching, listening, get into the comments on YouTube, let us know the matches you would like to see happen, and we'll put our heads together and come up with some as well for a future episode of the Jiu Jitsu Oracle. But that is it for the big talking points coming out of last weekend's Polaris event in the UK.